at Harvard since 2001. So I'm due for a visit.
Absolutely. New offices. So usually we start a couple minutes late. So at 11:03, I will assume we will start. And Herman, please take over when,
So it's
or
Arpita.
Arpita, please take over at that time.
Sure, sure. So, Milind, you're going to talk about the seminar a bit, and then I'll introduce Kobi.
I guess there's nothing specific to say, so I think we should just go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, this is the last talk. So we were just telling Kobi that this, like, today we're having the last talk of our seminar series for
Okay.
the
So
spring.
then give me one minute.
Sure.
Christoph, hello.
Hello.
Great to see you.
Look forward to your performance.
With no jet lag.
That's right. There are some upsides to this situation.
What time is it in Israel?
It's 6 p.m. I'm broadcasting from my office. We're back in school teaching.
Cool. That's awesome. So we will start in about half a minute.
You guys see my title slide now, right?
Yep.
And now slide number 2.
Yep.
Good. I think we should go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. This is the AI for Social Impact seminar series at our Harvard Center for Research on Computation and Society. My name is Milind Tambe, Director of CRCS. And this is the last seminar of our seminar series for this semester. And mainly I wanted to thank the organizers, Herman Saxono and Arpita Biswas, who have organized this seminar series. Really great job. Thank you to both of you for organizing this series. I wanted to thank Hyla Bernstein for, directing all of these events at Circus. And I most of all wanted to thank the audience. I recognize several people who have stuck with us throughout this seminar series, and I really appreciate your interest. And I hope next semester we will have more of a hybrid series. So some of it may be in person, and I hope you will continue to be with us as our seminar series continues. So with that, I'm delighted that Professor Kobi Gal is visiting with us today. I'm going to hand this over to Arpita to introduce Professor Kobi Gal.
Thank you. Thank you, Milind. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Kobi Gal today. Professor Gal is a faculty member of the Department of Software and Information Systems Engineering at the Ben Gurion University. And he's also a reader at the School of Informatics at the University of Edinburgh. His work investigates representations and algorithms for making decisions in heterogeneous groups comprising both people and computational agents. Professor Gal is the recipient of the Wolf Foundation's 2013 Krill Prize for Young Israeli Scientists. a Marie Curie internship fellowship, international fellowship, and a 3-time recipient of Harvard University's Outstanding Teacher Award. Together with his co-authors, he has won the Best Student Paper at UMAP 19, the Best Paper at EC 2016, and the Best Student Paper at ETM 2014. With this, I would hand it over to Professor Kobi. Welcome him with an applause.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be at Harvard, if only virtually. I miss you guys. And so because I'm the last speaker, I want to open with maybe a little bit reflection about why I think AI and social good are such amazing topics and so much fun to research. And I'm going to draw on this loop that Eric Rice spoke about when he gave a talk. And he identified, he called it an iterative loop. I'm kind of drawing on it, but he identified this interesting situation where there's a social problem and we need AI to come and help us to solve this social problem. And we're used to that in computer science. You know, we're often faced with an application that is designed to solve a particular problem. But what's special about social problems is that they require intervention. And if you think about it, the AI solution is not just an algorithm, it is also being deployed in the wild, as people say. And when it's deployed, it's going to affect and influence the society that it is intervening in. And that creates challenges, problems, opportunities that in turn feed additional problems to this intervention loop, as I call it. And I hope Eric forgives me for giving this my own name to this very interesting loop. And I think that's what makes this research in this growing field so interesting. And in particular, I'm just giving a 3 breakthroughs that social problems have spawned in AI, some of which have been discussed in this seminar series, such as Brian Wilder's work together with Millen's lab on AI augmented intervention for HIV prevention in homeless youth. There's beautiful work by Kevin Leighton Brown and colleagues about agricultural marketplaces in Uganda, and a wonderful, I think it's a 2018 talk on how to do research in AI for social good that I really recommend that you guys listen to. There's work by Haris Aziz and John Dickerson on new algorithms for kidney exchange. And in particular, Anderson and Lauren Wilcox's lab have been providing us with interesting deployment ideas for AI in healthcare, and that they call the last mile of AI, that draws upon coordination and trust issues that I found really interesting. So all of these amazing ideas and breakthroughs in AI have been spawned by social problems. And my own bent on this is, how can we build societies to work better as a team? So what I care about interventions is really making them intelligent and supportive to guide participants to be better collaborators with others. And this is not a new problem in AI. It's been around for a while, but I really care about the social aspect of getting these interventions to work. If you think about it, today, we have a new type of teamwork or group work that is fundamentally different from the kinds of group work that AI and people like Milland have been studying in the late 90s and early 2000s. And here's an example of my course here at Ben Gurion University. So I'm teaching Introduction to Probability. Now we have a hybrid teaching model post-COVID. So part of the students are at home, part of the students are in class with me. There's an infrared camera that is following me around. I have to keep everyone happy and excited about the course. So if someone at home has a question on chat, I need to be able to understand that in real time and address that person while still keeping the rest of the class engaged. That's really, really hard. And if you think about it, this kind of open group work opens the door for a lot of interesting contributions and to the design of AI technologies for intelligent interventions. So, let's define together this new type of open group work, which is conducted online. So it's loosely coupled in the sense that these people share a common goal, whether generating, disseminating, or learning about knowledge, but they essentially work alone and they communicate in a very controlled way. Okay, well, maybe the Israeli students communicate in a less controlled way because they keep interrupting, but there's some kind of protocol that allows them to exchange ideas and information with each other. And of course, this group work is tremendously diverse because participants, in this case students, they come with different motivations and skills, and they still need to be able to work together. You know, I love to get the students to work together and exchange ideas because I know that's when the learning actually happens. And actually, you should keep that in mind for the rest of the talk. And they're truly open in the sense that everyone can opt in or opt out of the course. They don't have to come to class. They can see the Zoom link at home. And it's my job to get them to be engaged enough and happy enough so that they actually come to class. That's a really hard job. So within this context of open group work, I give you one example, but there are many others. Stack Overflow, which is amazing in the sense that if I have an issue with programming, then a high school student in India can help me solve it just by answering a question on this site. My friend Gabi, who's a surgeon in Seattle, loves this hurry up and wait paradigm. Whenever he's between operations, he takes out his device and he classifies a few galaxies to participate in this citizen science project called Galaxy Zoo. And so we spoke about forums. You're looking here at a forum created at MIT by David Karger and colleagues called Nota Bene, which is amazing. It's not a traditional forum. You're looking at the class reading, and what people are actually able to do is anchor comments in the text of the class reading, and this in-place structure of the forums allows students to interact while they are reading the course material and provide context for the discussion. So look at the power of context. So suppose the students cram for an exam at 3 a.m., then they can actually see everything that was said about, for example, this is a biology course. So for example, about amino acids throughout the course. They don't need to start looking for it back and scrolling up and down the way traditional course forums happen. So all of these are examples of nice open group work. And you know, when Milind invited me to give this talk, he said, Kobi, you do a lot of interesting work in various diverse areas. Can you talk a little bit about scalability and impact? And I think that's exactly the point, Milind. So all of these amazing domains, how can we learn to generalize solutions that can adapt to these different types of domains? And really, if you only take one point from my talk today, then I'd like that point to be, look at the insights from social science. So I claim that to get our AI solutions to scale up, to really make an impact, we have to pay attention to behavioral norms and mechanisms that drive the way people behave in open group work. And I'm going to talk about 3 such aspects today and linking them to work in my lab. So the first one is a behavioral norm called the gold gradient hypothesis. And before I'll get going, I should also like to tell you guys that you should feel free to stop me at any point in the talk if you have questions, okay? Because of issues with Mac and Zoom, I can't see your camera. I had to share my entire screen, but I can hear if you interrupt. And I'd be delighted if you guys do that. So what is the gold gradient hypothesis? So in Edinburgh, there's my favorite cafe here. And I love these loyalty cards. They really get me to buy a lot more coffee, especially when I'm writing papers. And of course, it's a very simple idea, right? Organisms, they increase in activity as they get closer and closer towards the goal or a goal. And this isn't rocket science. I mean, it should be completely obvious to you that this works and that this kind of gold gradient steering phenomenon has been observed in animals and in humans, and of course is commonly used by advertisers and corporations to get us to consume more. But in the context of open group work, it's also been used in other more collaborative settings. So the idea of badges has, here you're seeing, I think it's Duolingo, is very common in online sites, and it has also been extensively studied by economists. So I really recommend Nicola Morlica's paper on online badge behavior for a nice theoretical design of how these gamification elements kind of drive our behavior over time. So in particular, I'd like to talk about Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow has an extensive set of badges, and they have 3 tiers for the badges: bronze, gold, and silver. And as you can expect, they reward you for the type of activities you do on the Stack Overflow site. So whether or not you're writing questions or providing answers or voting for a question or an answer, like giving a like, which you can do in Stack Overflow. There are many, many different types of activities. And you could see here that gold users, like those heavy users, they're responsible for a large % of the contribution in Stack Overflow. And that's why these badges are, or were, commonly considered to be really good driving mechanisms of the site. So there's a famous paper by John Anderson and colleagues from 2013 that kind of defines the gold gradient hypothesis and formalizes it with respect to Stack Overflow. And it uses this concept of steering to describe how people work towards the goal before getting the badge. And this is one graph that summarizes this notion. So the x-axis is the number of days people work relative to the badge win. So the 0 point is when people get the badge, and the y-axis is the number of actions per day. And you can see there are 4 different types of actions in this graph. So for example, the green curve represents users liking other people's questions. And as you can see here, as they get closer to the badge, following the gold gradient hypothesis, they increase the amount of activity, which is amazing. And can everyone see what happens after they get the badge? Can anyone tell me what happens? Trying a question here.
They get disincentivized.
Yes, so they drop, exactly, Milan, they drop their level of contribution to approximately the same, at least in this graph here, that is an empirical investigation of the electoral badge with several thousand users. You can see that the minute they get the badge, and this should be logical to you, they stop making this increase in contribution. They fall back to the distribution that we call preferred distribution, that represents the way they work usually. And this paper founded this theory and also provided models for describing this kind of behavior. And as you can see, the steering behavior that they identified is like a finely tuned spear, or spare, I think is the right term in English, in the sense that it only incentivizes the action that you want to incentivize. So in this case, giving a person a badge for doing question votes isn't going to make that person contribute more questions. So it's because, as you can see here, the red curve stays the same. So it's this mechanism that gets people to contribute exactly the kind of question that you wanted. And my students, Stavianovsky and Nick Hernell, were really interested in this question. Is steering, as that Anderson and colleagues identified, a one-size-fits-all phenomenon? I mean, does it actually apply to different people in different contexts? And they did stay in the context of Stack Overflow, and they wanted to investigate this question. And so the first thing they did is that they chose to describe user activity along with different parameters. So one of these parameters are consistency. That means how essentially how many days per week are you going to be active on Stack Overflow, making certain kinds of contributions. Again, Stack Overflow is a rich, open group work setting. You can make many different kinds of activities there. And intensity is the other side of this dimension of user activity. That is, given that you're working, how hard are you working? So are you a weekend warrior? Or do you work more during the weekdays? That it measures the intensity of the activity that you make on a given day. And when you use common clustering algorithms to separate people into groups, here we show a scatter plot where the x-axis is consistency, the y-axis is intensity, and we plot several thousands of Stack Overflow users. You can see that we can nicely determine 3 different types of groups. So there's what we call the dabblers. These are users whose activity is characterized by low consistency and intensity. So if you can see, and they average less than a single edit action per week. This is what this analysis was looking at, edit actions. So it's people editing other people's comments. And there's a medium size group, and there's this interesting group we call the busy bees. The busy bees are high activity, and you can see that there's a high level of intensity, at least 8 edits per week, and they regularly work more than 3 days on any given week. So now that we've distinguished between these 3 groups, we can look at the way they steer and plot this on a graph, and we see something very interesting that we didn't see in the original Anderson graph, mainly that they steer quite differently. As you can see, the high group, the high intensity group, those busy bees, they exhibit a much higher intensity of a steering effect than do the other groups. And this is quite interesting. So it turns out that people don't necessarily steer the same way. But the next question to consider is, do badges really matter in this context? If there are some people that are affected far less by steering than others, do they matter? And to raise this question even more, I want to show you that the way that these groups contribute, the ways the contribution of these groups break up according to the different badges. So you would think that the low consistency and the medium consistency groups, they don't matter much because, as I showed you earlier, they don't represent a high contribution of content to the site. But as you can see here, they're very consistent. So the gold users, obviously they're going to be representing a large part of the busy bees, but they also represent over 44% of the medium group and over 60% of the low group. And that should tell you something about these low and medium group contributors. They're consistent, and they may not care about badges as much as we thought earlier. And so, and together with Ariel Procaccia and his student, Greg Kine, and my student Nick worked with them to understand about what is it about steering that we can predict by using computational models. So if some people are not affected by steering, like you see in this picture here, can we learn to identify them and use that information to improve the way that that interaction and questions and answer contributions are made on sites such as Stack Overflow? And what I'd like to do is to present 3 models, and they kind of subsume each other. So they go from model 0 to model 2. Model 0 simply means it's a null hypothesis. It means no steering. And it's a probabilistic model. So we're going to be learning a separate model for each user. PU represents the user preferred distribution, those flat lines that you saw in the graph I showed you earlier from Anderson's paper. And according to our model, PU is going to generate a distribution over the number of actions that you're going to be observing the user doing every day. It actually induces an inflated Poisson. So you can think of each day provides you with a sample that is drawn from a Poisson distribution that is determined by PU. And that is what you're observing. So of course, PU itself is a latent variable, and that's why it doesn't have any color. So this is the null hypothesis, a user that is affected by no steering, consistent, doesn't care about badges. Model 1 is a one-size-fits-all steering approach. So I'm going to introduce the concept of steering by allowing the number of actions to deviate in a controlled fashion by this beta parameter in a very simple way. So when beta is positive, the user is going to make additional number of counts because the user is steering. It's going to do more work than the distribution PU would entail. And when beta is negative, it's the opposite. The user will make fewer contributions than PU would entail. And if you're looking at here, beta is kind of exterior to this template, and that's because it's a one-size-fits-all steering approach. So there's a single beta parameter for all users. Okay, so let's relax that assumption in model 2, which subsumes model 1, but also allows each particular user to control the extent that that user adheres to beta. So you can think of SU as kind of a Bernoulli variable. When SU is 0, we do not adhere to beta at all, so we're back to not being steered. And when SU is 1, we do adhere to beta. We are steered in accordance with this beta parameter. And each user can kind of weigh SU according to what is best a fit for that user's data. And when you apply a variational inference to populating these models with data from Stack Overflow, again, we were very lucky to collaborate with Stack Overflow, and they were willing to give us a lot of their data. You can see something really interesting. So what I'm showing you here is a scatter plot. And again, if you're interested in the results, you can read the ICDM paper, which goes into much more detail about the models and the machine learning. But if you're this is the model applied to several thousand users, and I'm kind of decomposing the adherence to steering to 2 parts, to how likely is someone about to actually contribute, and given that someone is contributing today, how much are you going to be contributing? So this is the x-axis and y-axis. So if you're here, if you're in the one area above and below, so if you're in this quadrant, then
I'm not sure I'm seeing which. When you say this, I'm not sure I'm.
Oh, you're not seeing my pointer. Is that it?
Right. Maybe you could just say which corner we should.
Okay, I'm sorry. When S1 equals 1 and S2 equals 1, then then you are strongly steered because you're adhering to the badge. S depends on how much you adhere to the badge. And when S is 0, when S1 is 0 and when S2 is 0, then you're strongly likely not to be steered. And you can see this also here. So if you look at these examples from the data set that represent strong steering people, you can see this on the upper right-hand corner. And these are just 5 users that were randomly sampled from the data set. And their true actions are in a dashed curve, and their fitted actions, according to the model, are in the green curve. You can see that for these strong users, you get a nice fit of the model to the data, and they're steered, right? You can see that they are going up and down. With respect, by the way, it might be with respect to days of the week, with respect to a badge, we're not sure, but we can see that they are indeed steered according to what the model is predicting. And it turns out that only 20% of people in the data were captured by this element of strong steering as predicted by the model. And about 40% of people were actually described by the model as people that do not adhere to the steering phenomenon and may not be influenced by badges whatsoever. And again, I can sample 5 people from the data set that correspond to this aspect of the model, and you can see that their contributions are far more consistent and indeed a good fit to what the model would entail. And so it might turn out that far fewer people are actually affected by badges than previously thought. And that's very interesting given how endemic and popular badges are in many sites and in Stack Overflow in particular. And as another piece of evidence to this puzzle about whether badges work or not, consider this user study that Stack Overflow were kind enough to let us do on their population. And what you're seeing here is one such question that we asked, which is, why do you contribute? And as you can see here, achieving badges isn't up very much on the top of the list. Like contributing to the community and increasing my own knowledge is much higher up on the list. And if you look at the percentages, interestingly, about 20% of the people do indeed represent badges as a incentive that they care about, or as a reason for contributing, which is very similar, of course, to the 20% that you saw in the scatter plot. Although, of course, this corresponds to different people. This user survey was completely anonymous and randomized, and so we can't really draw out any scientific conclusions from connecting these 2 results. But it does look like that that many people at least do not subjectively report that badges matter. And so maybe the last question to consider is, given that we see that there's growing evidence about the failure of badges to actually matter for people, why do we indeed see this bump in day 0? And it turns out, based on a proof that you can read in the paper, that there's this interesting steering effect that is a statistical effect that comes from the fact that we are steering the graph at the day 0, which is when the person actually refers to the badge. So to give you a little intuition about why we call it the phantom steering effect, let's think of the null hypothesis again. So let's assume that Kobi is not affected by badges whatsoever, and Kobi simply commits to actions that are drawn from the preferred distribution. And so every day that you're looking at an action, it's just drawn from my PN, from this preferred distribution, right? And if you're looking at the expectation of a sample that is drawn from this distribution, given that it's an unbiased estimate, you're going to end up with the expectation of the population, which is you're expecting to see just the average number of actions that I will do every day according to my preferred distribution. But this isn't what we're counting on day 0, ladies and gentlemen. On day 0, I don't care about individual days. I care about the cumulative contributions that I made, because I'm getting the badge at day 0. So you can imagine that I saw Kobi commit to one contribution on day 1, and here's another contribution on day 2. At some point, I'm going to cross the threshold and get the badge. This is day 0. And when you think about it, and Nick and Greg showed this theoretically in the paper, the probability of seeing more actions rather than fewer actions on the day that a user crosses the threshold is higher. Think about it, that when I get the badge, you're going to see me cross that threshold. And it's more likely that I'm going to be doing more work on the day that I cross the threshold as opposed to less work. And this is the actual theorem that they prove in the paper. So A0 UN is the number of actions you're expecting the user to do at day 0, user U to do at day 0, given that a threshold N exists for getting the badge. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it's equal to the expectation of the population, which you would expect, but you also add this additional component, which depends on the variance of the preferred distribution. And this also makes sense, because the more varied the user's contribution is, the more likely you are to see a high deviation in that user's contribution. And if that user has crossed the badge, the more likely that the user has committed more actions as opposed to fewer actions that were drawn from that user's distribution. And that's why you're seeing this bump, even for users that are not supposed to be steered. And I think that's a very nice theoretical kind of complement to the empirical results we've seen before that say that badges might be not the best contributor to getting people to be wonderful players, at least on Stack Overflow. And I should, before I move on, also say that Stack Overflow have a huge number of incentives at play in their website to guide users' interactions, such as reputation points and recommendations, and that it may very well be that some interesting interaction between these two actually drive behavior. And if you're interested in that, there's a lot of data that they give out for free, and I really recommend to look at it. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful domain. Any questions so far?
I have a question, Kobi. First of all, thank you for your energetic talk so far, and I'm sure we'll continue to enjoy the rest of it as well. We have a study which looks at negative incentivization. So basically, instead of giving positive badges, it's
Punishment.
Warning signal to say, don't take this action. And this is with human subjects, where we saw similar, initially, if you just looked at the average behavior of the entire subject population, the fit is so-so. But then you realize there's two groups of people, one who are responding to this negative warning or negative badge, and one group which just doesn't care, and they just keep doing their work no matter what. And so if you separate out the population, there's a great fit to the, of the model to the people who respond. And for the remaining people, it really doesn't matter because they just aren't paying attention or whatever is happening. And I'm kind of interpreting your results in a similar way, that basically there seems to be, like you showed in the 20 and 40, that there's a population that fits your model, and then there seems to be a population that, I mean, essentially you've separated it out with this S0 variable or this S variable, whether they pay attention to the badge or not. But is that a good way to interpret that basically there's two population, ones that fit the model? Yeah.
Well, the model is trying to explain all of the populations. That's why we have three models. And in the paper, we actually show that the second model fit the population best because it allowed individual users to vary how much they adhere to beta. And so that's where I got the 20%, 20%, 40% form. So we clustered the users with respect to how much they adhere to beta or not.
Got it. But if so I understand how you sort of folded the adherence to beta in the model, and that's great. But in a sense, there isn't like, I mean, what I'm saying is that in a sense, there's like, it's interesting that there's a cluster of people who are kind of adhering to the model, and then there's a cluster of people who are not, and there isn't like a continuous distribution of people in between, I guess.
I think that's a very interesting point, and you're right in the sense that notice that I can only look at this. Sorry about that. So there's 20% and 40%. That leaves another 40% of people that are kind of in the middle, and that's exactly what you're talking about. And that I don't have a good explanation for what they're doing on the website. And so you're right in the sense that there's a lot more to understand about what drives people's behavior. By the way, it's a very, very difficult problem to do computationally because there are all of these interesting cognitive variables that are interacting together and affecting human behavior. And we know that from lots and lots of literature and group decision-making in the social sciences. But what we're observing from the prism of Stack Overflow is this very narrow clickstream of what they're doing on the site. And it's very difficult to try and unleash what the hidden latent cognitive structures were that were affecting their behavior. And I'm assuming that it might be the same in your own domain.
There are also some questions in the chat window. I don't know, Arman or
So I can't see them because I have to share my entire screen. Please tell me, can someone read some of the questions?
Okay, I'll read the first questions. It's by Rahul. He asks that badges may help in building reputation and job lookout. Any comment on that?
Reputation and job lookout. Oh, you mean in searching jobs? This is an amazing point. Do you know people actually bring their Stack Overflow status to job interviews today? Or what they've done on Kaggle. So yes, the answer is yes, and that just shows you how strong these websites are, and about maybe that's an additional incentive that people drive their behavior. So what this person is saying, maybe I should have included a question saying, why do you contribute to get a good job?
Yeah, thank you for the answer. Second question is by Harman. Harman, do you want to ask the question? I see you're unmuted.
Sure. Yeah, a very interesting research and very interesting finding. I was just wondering if you have used self-determination theory to analyze this, because the theory says that intrinsic motivations from the feeling of competence, and that seems to be related to increasing knowledge and validation of knowledge, as well as relatedness by contributing to the community.
So I'm not aware of that theory, and I'd love it if you can send me a pointer to a paper.
Sure, I will share that later. Thank you.
Because as I said earlier, there's a lot at play here, and it's very difficult to kind of separate the effects of feedback, even when, for example, now we're looking at the effect of reputation which is another kind of incentive that Stack Overflow uses on what users do. And it's very difficult to kind of weed out the actual effect from all of the noise, because people are so different and they look at very different aspects of the Stack Overflow dashboard itself. So thank you.
I have a question. This is a very interesting view of a discrete reward in the form of a badge, which you can achieve after a cumulative set of activities. But I'm wondering how we can apply these kinds of analyses to more continuous kind of rewards, where you're looking more of like a points system as opposed to a level or a badge.
Right, right. Such as reputation, which is exactly what I was speaking of. And so we're extending this work as we speak to try to look at that kind of setting. But I agree that it's not clear whether we can just plug and play a model like this. So Nick thinks that we can take the scheme of the probabilistic model and also apply it to reputation. And by the way, there are many other kind of discrete measures of incentives that this model would be very difficult to explain, like leaderboards in Kaggle. So if you think about it, there are also incentive structures that highly affect the way people behave, but in very different ways. So how much effort are you going to be extending in writing a revised submission of your code, given that you're in 3rd place or in 10th place, and given that the people behind you are much closer than the people that are in front of you? All of these obviously affect the way we make decisions, and a model that has to capture them needs to specify how people are affected by their position in all of these different ways. Great. So I'll go on, and I should also say ahead of time, I'm planning to stop at 7 because I know people have more places to go, and we don't need to get through all of the studies, and you guys should feel free to contact me later for papers or for additional slides. And so the next study I want to talk about is a behavioral mechanism called cognitive engagement, which I really, really like. And it's a kind of measure that we can use to apply to the way students interact, and not just students, but participants interact and discuss things together. So it's a form of interaction in open group work. But before I explain exactly what cognitive engagement is, I want to return to this notion of forums and to define the concept of seeding. And this should be very, very, very clear to us instructors and teaching assistants. So imagine that I'm teaching, I mean, it's not imagine, I'm doing this right now. I'm teaching Introduction to Probability for like the 7th or 8th time. And every year I have a forum that gets used and thousands of messages get written. By the way, because I incentivize students to write messages, I give bonus points in the course that depend on how many posts people put in the forum. And people always tell me, oh, if you're doing that, then students will be incentivized to write messages that aren't very beneficial to learning, such as what is X, or I don't know, or when is class tomorrow? And you're right, some of the questions are indeed like that, but a small minority, for the most part, giving students bonus actually improves the quality of discussion on the forum. But I digress. So there's all of this amazing messages and learning going on in the forum. And now imagine I'm about to teach a new instance of this course. Wouldn't it be great if I could initialize the course with those messages that were deemed to be the most beneficial to get students to interact together and to engage in learning? That would be amazing, right? Because the students would enter the course, they would hit the ground running. Instead of having to build all these discussions from scratch, there'll be some seeds planted in the new forum that provide them with kind of anchors that can use to improve the learning. And this is exactly what my student, Einat Schusterman, was studying for her thesis, and working together with David Karger and the University of California at Davis. So they use this Nota Bene system to provide a forum to a 800 student course in biology And I'll tell you a few more words about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to define this notion of a seeding score, which is essentially what we came up with when we did a lot of brainstorming with the instructors about what makes a thread in a forum good for seeding. And the instructors thought about, well, we need to consider to what degree does a post relate to the learning objective of the lecture, how much effort went into writing the post, does the post raise a new idea or a question that goes beyond the content that is presented in the reading material, and of course, how many responses did the post generate? You would think that posts that generate many responses actually get the conversation going. That must be a very good post for seeding. But look at this, look at the last example here. It's actually not the case, right? So this post generated, the last example generated 15 responses, but it's a discussion about course logistics. Look at the last column on the right. Whereas if you look at the first example, it's a comment that the instructor thinks forces students to think about inputs and outputs of a biological system, and that's very good for building mental concepts about what they were trying to study. So, you know, the instructors know what constitutes a good seed or a good post, but they have thousands and thousands of these messages. So we want to help them identify these seeding scores and then seed them, initialize new courses with these seeds. So of course, this is where AI can come into the rescue in the form of an intervention model. The first thing that I want to do is to be able to automatically identify, using supervised learning, posts according to their seeding score. And again, I won't go into the details, but cognitive engagement was a very important aspect of the features we use to help us identify good posts. And I'll tell a little bit more about cognitive engagement now. It's such an amazing concept. It was first laid down by Chi and Wiley, that were looking to provide ways of categorizing how students interact in a classroom. And they showed a causal relationship in this really amazing paper that I highly recommend that you read. It's really very interesting paper. A causal relationship between the types of activities students do in class and their learning benefits. So at the very bottom of this cognitive engagement pyramid, it's students who are just, if they're interacting in a forum, then they're asking each other what time is class. So they're completely off topic. Now, if you go up above, one level above, you're in this active space. So a post forum would be active if a student is asking something about the material in a form of a question. So the student is engaging now with the material in some way, but he or she is not contributing and not summarizing anything and not involving any kind of insight. At the top of the pyramid, where the good stuff is, that's the interactive point. Look at this student. So the student is writing a post that relates to another student, which is a very important aspect of an interactive cognitive engagement, and also provide some kind of insight or analysis to the actual material. And that's really where you want to go. And they developed a system for classifying students' messages in forums, and this was also done by Caroline Rosette from CMU, that depended on the way that the students discuss concepts with each other. And I've just shown you several examples here. And I should also stress that cognitive engagement isn't about understanding. So the students could be talking and being completely off track about what a peptic molecule is, but they could still be corresponding to high cognitive engagement because they're discussing material and they're analyzing it. So this is a very important point. It's not about understanding material, it's about how engaged you are with another student. And if you think about it, that is really where the good stuff lies. So Chi and Wiley showed that there's a causal relationship between the type of cognitive engagement that students apply in class and their learning benefits as determined by performance in exams. And so my student Einat took this idea forward with the aspect of seeding to lay down a series of hypotheses. And to get there, she designed this between study element. So in a new course in Davis, we collected data from the first half of the course when students were interacting over a forum and no seeding was applied. So we didn't do anything to the forum. We started from scratch. But starting the second half of the course, after a midterm that was used to kind of standardize the students' achievements, in the second half of the course, we applied seeding in different treatment groups. So we actually run an intervention, a between study design, a controlled randomized trial that was used to evaluate different seeding methodologies. So what seeding methodologies did we care about? Well, for each lecture in the second half of the course, I'm going to select candidate seeds from past course instances, and I'm going to rank them according to some scoring function. And I'm going to present the top 15 seeds to instructors who can say yes or no for any of these seeds and decide and kind of give the okay for the system to initialize the forum for the next week lecture with these seeds. So the study used these, it was a randomized control study. There were 3 groups. Again, in the second half, if a student fell in the control group, then things continued as before. There was no seeding. But if a student fell in the long group, which you see on the bottom, that was kind of a baseline seeding technique that simply extracted the comments with the highest number of exchanges and used those to rank the seeds. So the more exchanges a comment had, the more likely it was to appear on top of the ranking list for seeding. And the AI, or the machine learning group, they ranked seeds according to their predicting seeding score, as in the supervised model I showed you. And the Knott's hypothesis was that we should see differences in behavior with respect to the learning benefits of students and the level of the CE that they engaged in between these different conditions. And of course, in particular, she hoped that students who saw the AI seeded condition were more likely to be exhibiting higher level of CEs and to be more successful in the course. And I do want to stress that there was some point of deception going on here, and we should get to ethical reasoning in the last 2 minutes of this talk, which is very, very close. And so we constructed the seeds as if they came from a fictitious student. I mean, there are 800 students in the course, so it's easy to invent a fictitious student. He was called Lee. And Lee was a very, very hard-working student. He always commented the first in class for every reading. And again, Lee was automatically generated, whether by the AI algorithm or whether by this baseline condition. And yes, we did receive all of the ethics that were required, all of the ethical treatment procedure confirmation that were required. Also, students needed to opt in to participate in an AI type study in order for us to use their data. So it's not just telling the students that they'll be able to participate in a study with the option of opting out. No, it was telling the students they're participating in a study and requesting them to opt in. It's very different, much harder to get consent like that. And so the results were indeed very interesting. I'm looking now at the cognitive engagement that was measured in the final part of the course for each of the group. And as you can see here, if you recall interactive, that's the top of the cognitive engagement pyramid. There were many more comments made by the machine learning induced seeds that were high on the cognitive engagement list, that were interactive, and that discussed material in a beneficial way than in the other types of conditions. And conversely, there were fewer lower type cognitive engagement messages for the machine learning / AI generated seeds than for the other conditions. Now, that's great, but what about the actual student performance? Did it lead to better learning gains? And for that, we looked at the types of questions in the final exam in the course that related to the seeds that we chose. Because this course is very nice. They identify for each lecture a set of learning goals. And we can look at the proximity between a learning goal and a post and choose which posts correspond highly to a particular learning goal. And then we can compare seed to learning goal with respect to how well students perform. And we did a difference in differences analysis, which is a kind of linear regression where you have dummy variables for the different conditions to try to pinpoint a causal relationship between the seeding condition and the success on the final exam. And the first thing you want to point out, and this indeed you should really hope that this happens, is that there should be no difference in the scores in the midterm exam between the two active conditions, because then the students are starting off equally. But as you can see in the final exam, you can see two interesting things. First of all, for all conditions, the grade in the final exam was significantly lower than the midterm. But that's okay. I mean, we don't care about that. What we care about is the difference between the machine learning AI seeded condition and the control. And as you can see here, there was a statistically significant difference in the final grade between those questions that mattered, that were discussed in the seeds between the two conditions. And indeed, that's because the AI seeded conditions were much more relevant. The posts were much more important and generated good discussion than the ones that were generated by the heuristic. And before I go on, I should also say that even the course staff themselves, when they needed to say about each seed, whether it was kosher or not kosher to be put in the next for the next week's forum, they also didn't know which condition they were looking at. So we kept them ignorant of that in order not to influence the results in any way. So I'm going to stop here. I won't talk about incentive design in this talk, but again, you're very welcome to talk to me about that. And I'll summarize, and then if there are, I'd love to open the floor for any more questions. So, you know, what I really care about doing, what I think my career, what I would love for my career to do is to take this idea of mechanism design that we're used to seeing in traditional multi-agent systems and AI systems that deal with artificial actors, and kind of extend them to deal with these interesting collaborative group work settings, which are more complex in the sense that they include people, and therefore they require behavior prediction. So we need to understand how people make decisions. We saw an example of that today with graphical models. We need to learn about policies for intervention. I didn't talk about that today, but to do that, we can use reinforcement learning or other traditional AI algorithms applied to this new and interesting type of setting. So Millen's lab is doing a lot of that interesting stuff. And also we need to care about incentives, how to get the participants of these open group work to do the right thing. And we spoke about reward mechanisms today in the context of Stack Overflow as one such incentive that might not be working as well as people thought. And as you can see from this layout, there's a lot of interesting turf here waiting for talented researchers such as yourself to bite into, such as how to do task allocation in these interesting groups, looking at responsibility and transparency, which is work that we've just begun exploring in the context of compatibility together with Ejie Komar and Levi Lelis. And of course, all of the ethical and moral issues that arise from trying to influence and get people to do stuff that they might not want to be doing at this point. So how much, you know, authority can an AI system take upon itself to try to nudge people to do effort where effort would not have been done otherwise? What kind of constraints, what kind of regulations should an AI system adhere to in that realm? I think these are fascinating questions that I would love to experiment and to study with you. So please be in touch with me if these things interest you. I'm always looking for collaborators, fun collaborators to work with. And so all I have left to do is to give thanks to my amazing group of students and collaborators, without whom this talk would not be possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kobi. And this talk was wonderful. I mean, it was so engaging.
It was high in the engagement. Was it high in the pyramid? I'm happy.
Yeah, I
Thanks
mean,
to Millen.
Yeah, I mean, Millen has to go to another meeting, but he just he thanked you for like speaking at our seminar. It was extremely nice. I have a quick question, and then we can open it to everyone because you are staying for 15 more minutes. So I'm just wondering how different the results would be when you have both rewards and penalties together in a particular reward mechanism.
Yeah, so that also, Millen's question prompted me about that. And we know that penalties work very differently than rewards. I mean, we know that from seminal work in cognitive psychology by Kahneman and Tversky, looking at different ways. We know that punishments have a far greater effect on behavior in some situations than rewards. And you need to come up with utility functions that represent that when you're looking at these incentives. And so in Nick's model, utility was not a first-class player. He was inspired by Anderson's model that was indeed cooperating to utility. But our model was generally probabilistic. It would be very interesting to look at different types of model utility value based on probabilistic measures with respect to punishments. And maybe we should talk about that offline. I mean, I would need to know more about your domain.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would try to okay, let me thank everyone to be here. I mean, it was wonderful having seeing you like in all the seminars, all the participants. And one quick announcement. Actually, we are still going to have our Rising Star talk this Thursday at 12 Eastern Time. So please attend that. It's going to be on technology and society. So with that, I think we can stop our.
Oh, hold on. There are a few. Oh, you want to